The city was cloaked in darkness, with rain pouring relentlessly from the heavens, turning the streets into slick rivers of asphalt. Inside St. Augustine Memorial Hospital, the emergency room buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Patients moaned in pain. Nurses rushed from one bed to another, and doctors barked orders over the beeping of heart monitors and the shuffle of gurneys. Dr. Richard Calloway, the chief of emergency medicine, stood at the center of it all, issuing commands with the detached efficiency that came from years of experience. His reputation preceded him, brilliant, sharp, but undeniably cold. To Richard, medicine was a science, not a charity. He treated patients, but he did not sympathize with them. Then came the moment that would alter everything. The automatic doors of the burst open, and two paramedics pushed in a stretcher carrying a man soaked in rain and smeared with blood. The man's left arm hung at an odd angle, clearly broken, and his face was marred with bruises. His breathing was labored, his chest rising and falling with visible effort. Male, late 30s, car accident victim, one of the paramedics reported breathlessly. Possible internal bleeding, unconscious when we found him, but he came to during transport. Name's Jamal Carter, ID found in his wallet. At the sound of that name, Richard's gaze flicked toward the patient. Jamal Carter was black. His clothes were nice, too nice for someone Richard would usually see at this hour. Drenched and bleeding, but Richard had seen enough to form an immediate assumption. The doctor's expression hardened, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Was he intoxicated? Richard asked, voice cool and clipped. No sign of alcohol on him. But we haven't done any tests yet. The paramedic answered. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose. What about drugs? Sir, there's no indication. Run a tox screen. Richard interrupted, already disinterested. I want a full panel before anything else. The paramedic exchanged a glance with the nurse, Samantha Ruiz, who had been following the exchange closely. Doctor, he's in pain, she interjected. We need to stabilize him. He needs a tox screen. Richard repeated coldly. For all we know, he was high and crashed his car. We're not going to waste resources if he did this to himself. Jamal groaned on the stretcher, his swollen eyelids flickering open. His voice was hoarse, his throat dry from dehydration. Please, he murmured. Help. Richard barely glanced at him. We're done here, he said, stepping back. Take him somewhere else. The words rang through the air, heavy with finality. Samantha stiffened. Doctor, this is a hospital, and I decide who we treat. Richard snapped. Now move him out of my The paramedics hesitated. Samantha, face tight with disbelief, shook her head in disgust. But Richard was already walking away. He did not look back. And that would be his mistake. Jamal Carter lay on the stretcher, struggling against the pain radiating through his body. His vision was blurred, his limbs weak, but he heard everything. He heard the disdain in the doctor's voice, the accusations that he was just another addict who had gotten what he deserved. But Jamal Carter was no addict. He was a federal prosecutor. For years, Jamal had fought in courtrooms against corruption, discrimination, and crime. He had built a reputation as a fierce litigator, a man who pursued justice without fear or hesitation. He had spent his career ensuring that those who abused their power were held accountable. And tonight, he had just become a victim of the very injustice he fought against. As the paramedics wheeled him back out into the rain, Samantha followed, her frustration evident. I swear to God, she muttered, I am reporting him. He just sent a dying man back onto the street. One of the paramedics, a man in his 40s named Mike, gritted his teeth. We'll get him to another hospital. Hang in there, man, he said, squeezing Jamal's shoulder before they lifted him back into the ambulance. Jamal's mind swam through layers of pain, but anger burned underneath the surface. He wanted to speak, to tell them who he was, to demand that Richard Calloway face consequences. But his body betrayed him. He slipped into unconsciousness just as the ambulance sped off into the night. Samantha Ruiz did not go home that night. She stayed at the hospital, her stomach twisted in knots, unable to shake the memory of what had happened. And then she made a decision. Sitting in the break room, she pulled out her phone and wrote everything down, every word Richard had said. The way he had dismissed Jamal like he was nothing. The blatant discrimination. She didn't just send an email to hospital administration. She posted it online. By morning, the post had gone viral. #RacistDoctor was trending. Journalists picked up the story. Civil rights organizations took notice. The entire city was watching. Richard Calloway walked into work expecting another normal shift. Instead, he was met with cameras, reporters, and furious protesters outside the hospital. But he still didn't realize the full magnitude of what was about to happen. Because the man he had refused to treat? He wasn't just a random patient. He was a federal prosecutor. And he wasn't about to let this go. Jamal Carter woke up in a different hospital. His body sore but his mind clear. The moment he was conscious, he asked for his phone. There were hundreds of missed calls. His colleagues, his friends, the media, the world now knew what had happened to him. He read through the viral post Samantha had made. The outrage it had sparked. His stomach twisted, not because of the attention, but because of the pattern. This wasn't just about him. Richard Calloway had likely done this before. Jamal took a deep breath and made the first of many phone calls. To his team, to civil rights attorneys, to the Department of Justice. If Richard Calloway thought this would be forgotten, he was about to learn a lesson in justice. The morning after the incident, Richard Calloway arrived at St. Augustine Memorial Hospital expecting another routine day. He parked his BMW in his usual spot, straightened his crisp white coat, and strode towards the hospital entrance. But something was different. As he approached the main doors, he noticed a crowd gathered outside. At first, he assumed it was just a group of patients waiting or perhaps a minor protest about hospital fees, nothing out of the ordinary. But as he walked closer, he saw the cameras, the microphones, the protest signs. A group of angry demonstrators stood behind metal barricades, their voices rising in unison. Justice for Jamal. End racism in healthcare. Fire Dr. Calloway. Richard's stomach clenched. A few feet away, a CNN reporter was doing a live broadcast. The public is demanding answers after a shocking act of medical negligence at St. Augustine Memorial Hospital. The anchor reported, Dr. Richard Calloway, the head of the department, has come under fire for refusing to treat a critically injured black man, who was later identified as Jamal Carter, a federal prosecutor. The hospital has yet to release a statement, but the backlash is growing. Richard's pulse quickened. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected it to become public. As he hurried inside, he could feel the weight of eyes on him, nurses, patients, even his own colleagues whispering in hushed tones. The hospital's PR team was waiting for him near the elevators. Their expressions tense. Dr. Calloway, one of them said sharply, stepping in front of him before he could reach his office. We need to talk, now. In a conference room on the top floor, hospital administrators, legal advisors, and board members sat around a polished mahogany table. The CEO, a sharp-dressed woman named Eleanor Hastings, wasted no time. What the hell did you do? She snapped. Richard bristled. I did my job. No, Richard, Eleanor shot back. Your job is to save lives, not throw people onto the street because of your personal biases. The legal team interjected. This is a disaster. We have journalists, activists, and even the Department of Justice looking into this case. Richard stiffened. The DOJ? They can't possibly be involved. This is just some overblown. That somebody you refused to treat is a federal prosecutor. Another administrator cut in, and he's got a history of fighting cases just like this one. He's not going to let this slide. Richard. Silence filled the room. Eleanor rubbed her temples. You have one option. Public apology. Now. Richard's jaw clenched. I did nothing wrong. The room erupted into murmurs of frustration. If you don't apologize, we can't protect you. One of the lawyers warned. The hospital will have no choice but to distance itself from you. You'll be on your own. Richard stood, his face hard. I don't need to apologize for doing my job. Then he walked out, ignoring the calls behind him. But even as he stepped back into the hospital corridors, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going away. At 6:30 a.m., Jamal Carter sat at his dining table, still sore from his injuries, scrolling through the news on his phone. His name was everywhere. He had woken up to hundreds of missed calls, colleagues, journalists, friends, even government officials. His voicemail was full. His email inbox had exploded. But the one call that mattered most had already come. The Attorney General's office. Jamal set his phone down just as his chief investigator, Malcolm Hayes, knocked on the door. "You ready for this?" Malcolm asked. Stepping inside, Jamal exhaled. "They want a full investigation." "Good." Malcolm sat across from him. "This is bigger than you, Jamal. If this hospital has a history of discrimination, we need to expose it." "And Calloway?" Jamal's eyes darkened. "He's going to learn what happens when you violate someone's rights." Later that day, the Department of Justice announced that it was officially launching an investigation into St. Augustine Memorial Hospital for discriminatory medical practices. The NAACP, the ACLU, and several civil rights organizations issued statements calling for Calloway's resignation. And at St. Augustine, panic set in. Richard sat in his office, his back stiff as his lawyer. Stephen Grant paced the room. "Okay, listen," Stephen said. "We need a strategy. You can't just keep ignoring this. The hospital might fire you if you don't play this right." Richard's temper flared. "I'm not racist," he snapped. "This is a witch hunt." He was probably some criminal, high on drugs. "I was protecting hospital resources." Stephen's lips pressed into a thin line. "You sure about that?" Richard scoffed. "I know his type." Stephen tossed a manila folder onto Richard's desk. "Read that." Richard frowned, flipping it open. The first thing he saw was a photo, Jamal Carter, standing behind a podium, the seal of the Department of Justice behind him. He was shaking hands with the Attorney General. Below that were headlines. Federal prosecutor Jamal Carter leads landmark case against corrupt police department. Jamal Carter named one of the most influential lawyers in the country. Richard felt his stomach drop. "Yeah," Stephen said, crossing his arms. "That's who you threw out of your Richard was silent. "Now," Stephen continued, "you need to listen to me. You're about to be sued, possibly criminally charged, and destroyed in the court of public opinion. You're going to be labeled as a racist doctor. Your career? Over. Your license? Gone. Your reputation? Ruined." Richard's throat felt dry. Stephen leaned in. "Unless you start cooperating." But Richard wasn't ready to surrender yet. And that was another mistake. Jamal Carter sat in the conference room of the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, surrounded by a team of investigators. "Tell us everything," one of them said. Jamal took a deep breath and recounted every detail. What had happened in the hospital. How Calloway had refused him treatment. How he had prejudged him based on his skin color. "This isn't just about me," Jamal said. "I want to know if he's done this before." The investigators nodded. "We're already working on that." Within days, former patients came forward. A black woman who had been turned away while in labor. A Latino father whose sick child had been ignored. A young black teenager who had been accused of faking an injury. The pattern was undeniable. And now, Richard Calloway was about to face the fight of his life. The walls were closing in on Richard Calloway. For years, he had operated with impunity, confident in his status, his reputation, and the unspoken biases of the system that had always protected men like him. But the world had changed. The tide was turning, and this time, he was the one under scrutiny. Sitting in his dimly lit office, he stared at the hospital's official notice of suspension on his desk. He was to remain on leave, pending an internal review. The words burned into his brain. Suspended, not fired, yet, but it was coming. He could feel it. His phone vibrated. It was Stephen Grant, his lawyer. "Turn on the news," Stephen said flatly. Richard grabbed the remote, and the screen flickered to life. A woman in a navy blue blazer sat behind a sleek desk, delivering the news with cool precision. New developments in the case of Dr. Richard Calloway, the St. Augustine chief who is under investigation for medical discrimination. More former patients are coming forward with allegations of mistreatment, adding fuel to the already growing outrage. The screen changed to a black woman in her late 30s, her voice trembling with emotion. "I came in with severe abdominal pain. He dismissed it as menstrual cramps and told me to go home. Turns out, I had a ruptured appendix. I almost died because of him." The footage cut to a Latino father holding a picture of his son. "My boy was running a high fever." Calloway said he was exaggerating for attention. The next day, "My son was admitted to the ICU with pneumonia." Richard felt his skin crawl. Another voice, this time, a teenage black boy, his mother gripping his shoulder protectively. "I was playing basketball and hurt my knee. He looked at me and said, 'Let me guess, gang violence?' I was just a kid." I still remember how that felt. Stephen's voice crackled through the phone. They're building a pattern against you. Richard, this isn't just about Carter anymore. Richard clenched his fists. He had always assumed his actions would never come back to haunt him. He had been careless. And now, he was paying the price. Jamal Carter sat at the polished oak table in his lawyer's office, reviewing the documents in front of him. Across from him sat Sasha Whitmore, a renowned civil rights attorney who had taken on some of the biggest cases in the country. This isn't just a lawsuit, Sasha said, flipping through the pages. This is a statement. We're suing Calloway, the hospital, and pushing for a systemic review of discrimination in emergency medicine. Jamal nodded, his jaw tight. I don't just want compensation. I want justice. Sasha smirked. That's why I took your case. Within hours, the official filing hit the press. Federal prosecutor Jamal Carter files lawsuit against disgraced doctor and hospital. Legal battle begins over alleged racial discrimination in healthcare. The lawsuit demanded millions in damages. But more importantly, it sought policy changes, a full investigation, and Calloway's medical license revoked. The hospital board panicked. Their PR team scrambled. Eleanor Hastings, the CEO, called an emergency meeting. We need to cut Calloway loose. One board member argued, if we don't, we all go down with him. Eleanor nodded grimly. Then let's make it official. By the next morning, Richard Calloway received a certified letter. He was fired. For the first time in his career, Richard was no longer a doctor. And it was only going to get worse. Richard sat in his home office, disgraced, humiliated, and completely alone. His phone was flooded with missed calls, some from former colleagues who barely concealed their relief. Others from lawyers, journalists, and strangers hurling insults. His wife, Evelyn, had moved out with their son, taking refuge at her sister's house. His bank account, once overflowing, was now under threat from mounting legal fees. His future, once assured, was now a dark, empty void. He turned on the news, expecting more coverage of his downfall. Instead, what he saw made his blood run cold. The state medical board had launched an official review of his conduct. Dr. Calloway's history of racial bias and medical negligence has prompted an investigation into whether he should be permanently stripped of his medical license. He felt his throat tighten. This wasn't just about losing his job. This was about losing everything. His identity, his career, his legacy. And it was all his fault. The day of the first court hearing arrived. The courthouse was packed with reporters, activists, and onlookers eager to witness the trial of the man who had once stood at the top of his field, and had now fallen so far. Jamal Carter walked through the doors, his head held high, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, flanked by his legal team. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. This wasn't just about him. This was about every patient Calloway had mistreated. This was about justice. Across the room, Richard sat at the defendant's table, looking hollow. He had aged in the past few weeks. Dark circles under his eyes. His once proud posture now slumped. As the judge entered, the courtroom fell silent. Sasha Whitmore rose first. Your Honor, we intend to prove that the defendant engaged in a consistent pattern of racial discrimination, resulting in medical negligence and potential loss of life. Richard's lawyer, Stephen, tried to object, but the evidence was overwhelming. One by one, former patients took the stand. One by one, they told their stories. By the time Jamal took the witness stand, Richard felt like he was sinking into quicksand. Jamal looked at him, his eyes calm but unforgiving. Dr. Calloway didn't just refuse to treat me. He said clearly. He looked at me and saw a stereotype, not a human being. He made a decision that could have cost me my life. And he did it without a second thought. The courtroom was silent. Richard swallowed hard, his hands trembling. For the first time, he felt something he had never felt before. Regret. But it was too late. The trial had only just begun, and the worst was yet to come. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The case had been building for weeks, and the public's outrage had only grown louder. The once respected Dr. Richard Calloway was no longer a prestigious surgeon but a man whose very name was synonymous with racism and medical negligence. Sitting at the defense table, Richard could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. Every whisper, every side-eye glance from the gallery, every camera flash from reporters stationed at the back, It all served as a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. And now, it was his turn to be cross-examined. His lawyer, Stephen Grant, straightened his tie and stood up. Dr. Calloway, in your years as a physician, have you ever refused medical care to a patient based on their race? Richard forced his expression into one of calm professionalism. Of course not, he said smoothly. Stephen nodded and continued. Then why did you refuse treatment to Mr. Jamal Carter? Richard cleared his throat. I believed at the time that he was under the influence of drugs or alcohol. As an emergency room physician, I had to make a quick decision about resource allocation. So, to be clear, you believed he was intoxicated? Yes. Stephen turned and picked up a thick folder from the table. Dr. Calloway, are you aware that the toxicology report from the hospital found that Mr. Carter had no drugs or alcohol in his system? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Richard's jaw tightened. I wasn't aware at the time. But you refused him medical care before even running the test. Stephen pressed. Did you make an assumption based on his appearance? Richard hesitated. I made a medical judgment. A judgment based on bias. Stephen cut in. Judge Carolyn Walsh raised a hand. Mr. Grant, let's not put words in the witness's mouth. Let him answer. Stephen nodded. But the damage had already been done. Richard knew it. His defense was crumbling. Then it was the prosecution's turn. Sasha Whitmore approached the stand, her heels clicking against the polished courtroom floor. Dr. Calloway, let's talk about your history. Have you ever dismissed a black or Latino patient with less medical attention than others? Never. Sasha raised an eyebrow. Really? Because we have multiple testimonies saying otherwise. She turned to the jury and held up another stack of files. Patients who were refused treatment. People you assumed were drug addicts or criminals just because of their skin color. Children whose parents begged for help while you turned them away. Richard swallowed. I followed hospital policy. Sasha tilted her head. Hospital policy? Or your personal biases? Silence. Richard felt the sweat at the back of his neck. His fingers gripped the edge of the witness stand. Sasha leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so that only the jury and Richard could hear. You thought you'd get away with it, didn't you? Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He had no answer. The trial dragged on for another 3 weeks. The media frenzy continued, with protesters lining up outside the courthouse every single day. Civil rights activists demanded major healthcare reforms. The NAACP and ACLU filed additional complaints against the hospital, widening the scope of the investigation. Richard Calloway was now officially a pariah. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. People spit at his feet when he walked past them. His former colleagues ignored him, and his family stopped answering his calls. His wife, Evelyn, had filed for divorce. His medical license was under review. His bank account was bleeding from legal fees. And still, he couldn't shake the feeling of righteous indignation. Sitting in his hotel room one evening, he flipped through news articles. Every single headline painted him as the villain. Former chief faces consequences for medical racism. How many patients did Dr. Calloway harm? The trial that could change healthcare forever. He clenched his jaw, slamming the laptop shut. They don't know what it's like, he muttered. They don't know the pressure I was under. But deep down, something gnawed at him. Had he been wrong? Had he truly judged those patients fairly? He had convinced himself for years that he was making practical decisions, that his actions had nothing to do with race. But now, faced with mountains of evidence, he had no choice but to ask himself, was I really just another bigot in a white coat? The jury deliberated for 2 days. The entire country waited. When the foreman stood to deliver the verdict, the courtroom was silent. Richard's heart pounded as he watched the foreman hand a slip of paper to Judge Walsh. She unfolded it, took a breath, and read aloud. We, the jury, find the defendant, Dr. Richard Calloway, liable for medical negligence and racial discrimination. A gasp rippled through the room. Richard felt his stomach drop. Judge Walsh turned to him. Dr. Calloway, the court finds that your actions directly led to the suffering of multiple patients. Your refusal to treat Mr. Carter was not only unethical but a violation of civil rights laws. You are hereby ordered to pay $15 million in damages, and your case will be referred to the State Medical Board for license revocation. The gavel struck. Richard's world collapsed. A cheer erupted from the gallery. Reporters rushed out to break the news. Jamal Carter stood, shaking hands with his legal team, his face a mixture of relief and quiet satisfaction. Richard? He sat frozen, his mouth dry, his hands trembling. It was over. Everything, his career, his wealth, his reputation, was gone. Weeks passed. Richard Calloway had no job, no money, no license to practice medicine. He lived in a cheap motel, eating takeout, watching the world move on without him. Every day, he saw his own face on the news, a symbol of disgrace. One day, a letter arrived at his motel. From the state medical board. Dr. Calloway, we have concluded our review. Your medical license has been permanently revoked. You are prohibited from practicing medicine in the United States. Richard dropped the paper, staring at it as if it were a death sentence. No more hospitals, no more prestige. For the first time, he had to face the truth. He had done this to himself. One evening, he sat alone in a rundown diner, pushing food around his plate. A television played in the background. A familiar voice made him look up. Jamal Carter was being interviewed. This case was never just about me, Jamal was saying. It was about exposing a broken system, one that lets people in power abuse their positions. Calloway may have been the face of it, but he wasn't the only one. This was a message to everyone in healthcare: if you discriminate, if you refuse treatment because of race, you will be held accountable. Richard swallowed hard. For the first time, he saw himself through Jamal's eyes. Not as the victim, not as the wrongfully accused, but as the monster in the story. And that realization crushed him. Richard Calloway sat in the dimly lit motel room, staring at the peeling wallpaper. The silence was suffocating, pressing against his ears like the weight of a world he no longer belonged to. It had been months since the trial ended, since the verdict had been delivered, since his entire life had been stripped away. He had lost his job, his career, his reputation. His medical license had been revoked permanently, ensuring that he could never practice again. His wife, Evelyn, had finalized their divorce, taking their son with her. His bank account had been drained by legal fees and the $15 million judgment against him. And now, he had nothing. He had spent the past few weeks wandering through the wreckage of his former life, feeling like a ghost in his own existence. No hospitals would hire him. No private clinics wanted him. Even medical conferences that once begged for his attendance now blacklisted him. Everywhere he went, he saw the same thing: people whispering, their eyes filled with judgment, some even sneering in disgust. He was no longer Dr. Calloway, the esteemed chief. He was Richard Calloway, the disgraced doctor, the racist, the man who let a patient suffer because of his own prejudice. And he couldn't escape it. One night, as he sat at the edge of his motel bed, he reached for the half-empty bottle of whiskey sitting on the nightstand. For the first time in his life, he considered that maybe there was no way forward. Maybe there was nothing left for him. Maybe this was the end. But just as he lifted the bottle to his lips, a knock on the door startled him. He frowned, setting the bottle down. No one ever visited him anymore. Cautiously, he stood up and opened the door. Standing there, against the flickering neon light of the motel sign, was the last person he ever expected to see. Jamal Carter. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the man who had ruined him, or at least, that's how he had once seen it. Jamal Carter stood tall, dressed in a simple but sharp charcoal suit, his face unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Jamal sighed. "Are you going to let me in? Or should I talk to you through the door?" Richard blinked, stepping aside automatically. Jamal walked into the small, dingy motel room and took a glance around, at the empty bottles, the unmade bed, the stacks of unopened letters, probably more legal notices, debt collectors, maybe even hate mail. "You look like hell," Jamal said, crossing his arms. Richard scoffed bitterly. "I feel like hell." Jamal nodded. "Good, means you're not dead inside yet." Richard let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "So, what, you came here to gloat? To watch me wallow in misery?" "No," Jamal said calmly. "I came here to give you a choice." Richard frowned. "A choice?" Jamal reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He tossed it onto the nightstand. Richard hesitated before picking it up. He opened it, scanning the contents quickly. "A plane ticket. One way. South Carolina?" Richard asked, confused. Jamal nodded. There's a free clinic down there. Underserved community. Mostly Black and Latino patients. They need medical volunteers. I made some calls. They'll take you in, not as a doctor, but as a medical assistant. Training nurses. Helping with non-invasive procedures. Richard's heart pounded. Why the hell would you do this? Jamal exhaled. Because you need a way forward. And frankly, I need to know if you're capable of change. Richard stared at him, speechless. You don't deserve to wear a white coat again. Jamal continued. But you still have skills. And there are people who actually need help. People who would never have set foot in your back when you were too busy judging them. Richard swallowed hard. Why should I trust you? You don't have to, Jamal said, but you should trust yourself enough to know that if you stay here, you'll drink yourself into oblivion. And that would be a pathetic way to go. Richard clenched his fists. Everything in him wanted to reject the offer. To scream that he didn't need Jamal Carter's pity. But deep down, he knew the truth. Jamal was right. If he stayed here, he would die miserable and forgotten. He had lost everything, but maybe, just maybe, he could earn back a piece of his humanity. After a long pause, Richard picked up the plane ticket. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than despair. The clinic in Charleston, South Carolina was nothing like the gleaming hospitals Richard had once commanded. It was small, underfunded, and overwhelmed with patients. The first day, Richard was assigned to assist nurse practitioners, setting up medical equipment, checking vital signs, even cleaning examination rooms. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one giving orders. He was the one listening. And it was humbling. At first, the staff regarded him warily. They all knew who he was. His name had been all over the news. But as the weeks passed, they began to see something different. They saw a man who showed up every morning, even when no one spoke to him. A man who never complained, no matter how demeaning the work was. A man who, for the first time in his life, was trying to be better. One day, a young Black mother walked into the clinic with her sick daughter. Richard took their vitals, making sure the child was comfortable. Before leaving, the mother hesitated. You're that doctor, aren't you? She said softly. Richard stiffened. The mother studied him carefully. You ain't that man no more, are you? Richard swallowed. I don't know. She nodded. Keep trying. And then she walked out. And for the first time in years, Richard felt something like hope. Years passed. Richard never got his medical license back. He never returned to the prestigious world of hospitals and ERs. But that didn't matter anymore. He had rebuilt his life, not as a doctor, but as a man who helped others. Jamal Carter continued his career, becoming a high-ranking federal official. But every now and then, he would check in, not as an adversary, but as someone who had given Richard a second chance. One evening, as Richard finished his shift at the clinic, he stood outside, watching the sunset over Charleston. He had lost everything once. But maybe, just maybe, he had found something even greater. And for the first time in a long, long time, he was at peace.